Everybody. Oh, start that again because my microphone is all the way over there. I'll move it here. Hello, everybody. That's a bit better. Unfortunately, I can't do anything about the fact that I don't look like I'm glowing today. I just look like I'm really kind of jaundiced and ill. I don't know what to do about the light, really. Apart from order a blind, which I still haven't done. I'm very sorry. But you're not here to look at my face, are you? You're here to listen to my voice, because I'm reading The Fury, Part 2. We are close. We should hit the halfway point today. Big battle is on the horizon as Cal and Daisy and Adam and Brick face off against Rilke and the others. Rilke and the others have just been attacked by soldiers who kind of saw them and think they're related to whatever's going on in London with the man in the storm. Schiller has been shot and is very close to death. And the storm has started to move. So they've just had confirmation that the storm is starting to move. I don't know what's going to happen, but it is not good. And we're heading back to London now for the other part 3, which is the chapters that deal with the man in the storm. So courage is resistance to fear, mastery of fear, not absence of fear. Mark Twain. That's the quote that gets this started. Graham, before I start, I hope you're all well. I hope you're doing okay. I hope you're having a really, really lovely day. And I hope you're sitting somewhere nice for this. Graham, Thames House, 11:59 a.m. It's moving. Graham looked up from his screen, blinking the spots of light from his vision. The video footage from the field op in Norfolk had come in a few minutes ago, and he'd already watched it 4 times. The soldiers had been wearing helmet cams, standard procedure now for any offensive action, but what they had recorded just didn't make any sense. The kids had come out of the windmill, and the boy, the same one as before, had somehow changed. They didn't have any decent footage. The light that he had been pumping out was simply too bright for the cameras, saturating them, bleeding white. But somewhere in the blur, he swore he could make out a creature of flame with 2 huge, burning wings. Then, in an instant, they vanished. Graham had flicked back and forth from one frame to the next, just 1/30th of a second between them. In one, 4 normal kids and the boy in the inferno. In the next, an empty circle of fire, like when you took a photograph of a moving sparkler. And after that, there was just a hail of ash and burning embers. What he was looking at was unbelievable, even utterly impossible. It had to be some kind of camera glitch. Only every single piece of footage they had, 6 different cams, all showed the same thing. The worst of it was they'd also lost over 30 men. Graham didn't have the full report yet, but from what he'd heard in his brief call to General Stevens, there weren't even any bodies. The soldiers had simply been vaporised along with a windmill and a field of beet. "There's just dust," the man had told him. The other soldiers were all being treated for shock. Apparently 2 had tried to scratch out their own eyes. "Graham, did you hear me?" It was Sam sitting next to him. Sorry, what?" "It's moving." She jabbed her hand at the screen and he followed the rough arc of her chewed fingernail to see the satellite footage of the city. It showed everything from Watling Park in the north to Fortune Green in the south, and most of that was solid inkblot black. It was like watching a weather forecast and seeing the unmistakable spiral of a hurricane. This, too, had an eye in the centre, a pocket of absolute night that showed up black and blank on visible, infrared, UV, and every other lens they had. It was as though beyond that event horizon was nothing, no heat, no matter, no air, just a hole where the world should be. And Sam was right. The storm seemed to be shifting south, engulfing the train lines of West Hampstead. He saw a chunk of something huge lift up into the maelstrom, a warehouse, maybe the home-based store they had up there. It crumbled as it went, shedding pieces of itself as it vanished into the churning current. And that was as far as Sam got before the entire room lurched. Graham almost screamed, grabbing his chair so hard he thought he'd broken half his fingers. Every single monitor in the room went dark, the lights strobing as the emergency systems fought to gain control. When they booted back on, Graham saw that a crack had opened up in the 30-metre thick solid concrete ceiling of the bunker. Not good. "What the hell was that?" he asked. There was still a tremor running through the room, making his teeth chatter. Sam's monitor flashed back on, the satellite feed still in place. The storm's movement had increased, sliding south like a patch of oil slowly dripping towards the bottom of the screen. In its wake, it left an ocean of pitch, an empty trench where there had once been a city. Graham's jaw dropped. He could taste the dust of the room on his tongue, in his dry throat. It's coming this way. It's heading right for us. Oh, there's nothing left, said Sam. Oh, God, it's destroyed everything. But destroyed was the wrong word. Destruction left ruin, left rubble, left corpses. This thing left nothing. No bodies, no wrecks, no ash. It devoured it all. Graham knew that if he was standing there on the lip of that trench, he would see only darkness. The room shook again, the very earth around them seeming to groan in outrage like a helpless beast suffering some dreadful torture. There's nothing we can do, shouted a voice behind them. Graham looked to see Habib heading for the elevator. He shrugged an apology. You should go too. If you're still here when it arrived, then... He didn't need to say it. Graham knew that if the beast... The beast? Where did that come from? It's an attack. Just an attack. If it hit Thames House, then being underground wouldn't save them. It would reach down with fingers of storm, pull them up to the gaping hole of its mouth, and everything he had ever been would be eradicated. He turned back to the screen, hearing the soft chime of the elevator door. He's right, you know, he said. You should get out of here. Yeah, and leave you in charge, said Sam. No way. I don't trust a man to get us through this. She smiled gently, squeezing his shoulder, and he placed his hand on hers for a moment. If the storm continued south, then they'd leave, but there was still time. A muffled explosion rippled through the ceiling above them, more dust raining down, making such a racket that Graham almost didn't hear the phone on his desk. He picked it up. Yeah, this is Hailing. Graham, it's Stevens. His years of military service made him sit up straight in his chair when he heard the General's voice. Sir, he said, it's on the move. We know, said the General. We're out of options. Sir? We launched another air assault 15 minutes ago, but the bastard swallows everything we throw at it. Whatever is at the heart of this thing, it's not letting us close. You any closer to working out what we're dealing with? No, Graham said. You know what we know. It's not atomic, it's not meteorological, it's not geological, and it's not biological. But we know it's mobile. If it carries on its current trajectory, then it will hit the city in half an hour, the General's voice, usually so strong, was like a little boy's. It's almost as though it knows where it's going. You make any sense of that? It's going where there are people, Graham thought. No, sir, he said. And the other incident, the one by the coast, any more leads? No, sir. Graham, I need you to be honest with me. Stevens cleared his throat. Something bad coming. Do you think your team can identify this threat before it reaches the centre of London? My team, he replied, looking at Sam, at the empty room beyond her. He chewed on it for a moment, then said, No, sir. I don't think we can. A pause and a rattling sigh. Then lock yourself in good and tight, Graham, because we're going to nuke it. Sir? That must have been a mistake, surely. Graham almost laughed at the insanity of it. Can you please repeat that? You heard me, the older man said. We're out of options. We don't do something now, then there's no telling what will happen. It's growing. It's getting stronger, and it's moving. Contain the threat, Graham. Neutralise it. Worry about the collateral damage later. It's our policy overseas. Got to be our policy at home. But you can't, he stuttered. You can't authorise a nuclear strike on UK soil, on London. It's done. PM gave the green light 5 minutes ago. We're doing our best to get everyone out, but we have to do this quick. That's why I'm calling, Graham. You seal that bunker until this is over. Either that or you bolt, but I can't guarantee you'll get out of the blast zone. Not now. Dragon 1 is airborne as we speak. How long have we got? He asked. 90 minutes max. Almost certainly less. I'm sorry, Graham. Batten the hatches, hunker down. With any luck, we'll knock this thing clear into next week and get a hazmat team to you. ASAP. And if not? The General snorted down the phone. Not quite a laugh. If not, then God help us all. Good luck. And you, sir, Graham said, but it was to an empty line. He gently placed the phone back in its cradle, staring at it as if waiting to hear it ring again, waiting to hear the General say, Ha, got you, Graham. This is revenge for that time you rubbed chilies into the latrine bog roll out in Iraq. But of course it didn't. It wouldn't ring again. He turned to Sam. You heard that? She had. He could see it in the parchment grey sheen of her skin, her vacant stare. They're nuking London, she said, shaking her head. A tear wound down her cheek, tracing a path through the dust that had settled there. Oh, God, Graham, it's actually happening. He looked at the screen, at the city there. His city. If the attack... No. The beast. Deep down, you know it. If the beast didn't devour it, then an atomic blast would wipe it clean, leave it a ruin that nobody would be able to set foot inside for decades. There had to be another way, but his mind was an empty bowl. He swore and thumped the desk in frustration. You want to lock it down? Sam asked. There's enough supplies here to keep 100 people for a month. We'd be okay. Hide away. Shut the door behind them. Let the city burn. How could he live with himself if he did that? But what were the options? Make a run for it? Head south to where the general was running the operation? At least he'd have a good view of the mushroom cloud as it curled up over Big Ben. He thought of David, prayed that he had got out of the city, that he hadn't waited for Graham to come home. He started. Then the satellite feed flashed, somewhere around the Maida Vale. A tiny spot of flickering colour beneath the raging storm, as if something was burning through the screen from the other side. He craned forward, his nose practically against the glass. What is that? The footage was too wide to make out the source of the light, and after a second or two it vanished. Can we zoom in there? He said, pointing at the location where the flame had guttered out. Sam nodded, typing in a string of code. The satellite blurred, zoomed in, sharpened, blurred, zoomed in, sharpened 3 more times until the view was a handful of crescent-shaped streets and box-shaped houses. The storm was no longer visible, but it was close because its shadow stained the top half of the picture like a bruise. In it, there was no sign of life apart from 4 little dots, undistinguishable but unmistakable. It's them, he said, ramming the screen with his finger. Who? Sam asked. The kids from the coast. It sounded ludicrous, impossible, but then so did everything else that had happened today. Somehow he was sure of it. He would have bet everything on it. He would have bet his life on it. In fact, that's exactly what he was willing to do. He pushed himself up. Lock yourself in, Sam. Stay safe. She said, pushing up from her chair. No way. You go, I go. Sam, nothing. It's my job to look after this city. I won't hide my head in the sand. Whatever you've got planned, I'm with you. He nodded, walking into the elevator. 90 minutes till detonation. That was enough time if he could locate a motorcycle and hotwire it. He had no idea what they'd find if they got there, but at least they'd be doing something. If those kids were somehow good, at least he could warn them. And if not, he'd have the satisfaction of seeing them burn. The elevator closed, and Sam grabbed his hand as they headed up into the storm. They're going to nuke London. Nightmare. Afternoon. Theirs is not to reason why, theirs is but to do and die. Into the valley of death rode the 600. That was Tennyson's The Charge of the Light Brigade. Rilke. North London, 12:14 p.m. It seemed to take longer, this time, for life to catch them. The world snapped into place around her, and with it came a noise like no other, a roar so loud that it felt as if it was pushing her into the earth. She clamped her hands to her ears as another jet of milky vomit erupted from between her lips. But still the noise raged, part thunder, part howling cry, part ringing, as if she was standing inside a giant cathedral bell. She forced herself to open her eyes, already knowing what she would see there. The sky was alive, a madness of movement that boiled overhead like an upturned cauldron of oil. Vast clouds of matter circled in slow, almost graceful orbits. In them she could see scraps of things, the glint of a truck, the outline of a tree or a church spire, and countless smaller objects. People, she realised, that could have been leaves kicked up by the wind. The tornado was so dense that the sun was a copper penny in the sky, forgotten, the streets around her as dark as dusk. And in the centre of it all was him, the man in the storm. Rilke couldn't see him past the chaos of the clouds, but he was there. She could feel him, and as she could feel gravity pulling on her, calling to her with that ageless, endless inward breath. He was the ghost inside the machine, inside that engine of darkness and dust that raged over her. And his voice was the cry of 1,000,000 horns. Just like Revelations, she thought, remembering the stories she'd heard in church. The angels sound their trumpets, and the world ends. A lunatic cackle escaped her, drowned out by the storm. She was still on her knees, she realised, Schiller lying before her. Beads of blood hung over his wounds, just floating there as though they hadn't quite remembered what they should be doing, as if they were trapped somewhere between where they'd been and where they were now. He looked up at her, his left eye a crimson pool. Part of his skull was cracked where he'd been shot, chipped loose like a flake of flint. What lay beneath was slick and dark and matted. She cupped her hand to it as if to hold in his brain. "You did it, Schiller," she thought to him, knowing that her real voice would not carry here, that there was simply not room enough for it in the screaming air. "You brought us to him. I'm so proud of you." He smiled at her, and his eyes rolled back in their sockets. She shook his head gently until he focused again. Then she looked up at the storm. Did it know they were here? Could it sense them? "Help us!" she screamed inside her head. "Don't let my brother die!" The storm thrashed in its own fury, the sweeping clouds like the tentacles of 100 creatures writhing and coiling. Rilke looked around, past Marcus, whose face was a portrait of pure horror, past the new boy Howie, still locked inside his casket of ice, seeing a street, houses on both sides. Everything was covered in dirt and ash, a fine rain that still fell from the ruined sky. There was nobody else in sight. How did they talk to him? "Think, Rilke," she said, seeing her brother slip out of consciousness again. "Think, think, think, you stupid girl!" Schiller had to change. It was the only way. If he was an angel again, then the man in the storm had to notice him. It was too big to see them as they were now, too loud. It was like a combine harvester about to crush a ladybird. She placed her other hand on Schiller's cheek, lifting his head off the ground. He groaned, but he was still with her. He was still alive. "Once more, little brother," she told him. "Let it out, and the storm will see you." He shook his head, just the slightest of movements that she could feel in her fingers. "Once more," she repeated. "He only needs to know that you're here, then he'll fix you. I know he will, Schiller. I know it. You have to trust me." She cradled his head against her stomach and placed her free hand on his heart. "Let it out. Let it speak. He'll make you better and you won't have to be weak ever again. Let it out." Her brother's eyes emptied, and for a moment she thought she'd lost him. But he must have caught a glimpse of death there, of something worse than pain, worse than the fury, worse even than the storm, because his whole body suddenly lurched up as if he'd been woken from a nightmare. And with the motion came the fire, erupting in the furnaces of his eyes, flooding over his body, turning him into a phantom of blue and red and yellow. His wings unfolded, so bright against the brooding clouds. He screamed a word at the storm, a word that cut across the street, that pushed its way through house after house, demolishing them. And the man in the storm heard him. Something detonated in the middle of the tornado, an almighty crack that could have been the earth splitting. A shockwave ripped outwards, sending a cloud of debris surging up into the sky and out across the city, stripping away the clouds, revealing what lay beneath. He hung there, too big to be human, so much bigger than the tower blocks he soared above, and yet somehow still a man. He shimmered in the unsettled atmosphere like a heat haze, a mirage, his body made up of shifting shapes and shadow, his hands held out to his sides. His face was not really a face, just a spinning vortex that reminded her of those huge drills that carved tunnels into the mountains, an endless, seething gyre that sucked in everything around it. But it was his eyes, two gaping sockets in his head, so dead and yet so full of rancid glee. It was impossible to tell how far away the man was, a mile or two maybe, but Rilke knew those eyes had seen her. She felt them crawling over her face like corpse fingers, working their way into her head, into her thoughts. Her mind was suddenly a clockwork toy, a clumsy mess of tin and spring, peeled apart and broken by its touch. "It's a bad thing, a bad thing, a bad thing," someone in her railed, but she fought it. "He's not! He's going to save Schill! He has to save him because nothing else can! Please! Please! Please!" Schiller was standing now, or hovering, a foot above the road, that atomic pulse making the concrete vibrate. He spoke again, a rippling surge of energy that opened up a trench in the earth, channeling towards the man in the storm. And the man answered, whatever he was. That inward breath never so much as paused, but those eyes beamed their message directly into her head. Not words, not even images, just the awful silence and stillness of the end of all things. The sheer weight of it, of eternal, infinite nothingness, sent her reeling. She tripped over Howie, falling onto her back. The wind knocked from her lungs. That's all it will leave, she thought, a gaping hole where the world once sat. "No!" she screamed, the words sucked out of her mouth by the snapping wind, by the endless roar of the storm. She would not believe that. "Go to him, Schiller. Kneel down at his feet. Show him that you are here to serve." He he would surely open his arms and welcome them as his children, wouldn't he? He would skin the flesh from their souls, fillet their bones, leave them as pure fire. Go to him, little brother. No, run, take us away from here. No, little brother, this is where we belong. The two halves of her waged war, and she felt the little clockwork engine of her mind come apart even further. Schiller rose, a fish on a hook, the brightest thing in the sky. The man watched him, vast tidal waves of matter still flooding across London, engulfing everything they touched. Whip cracks of black lightning lashed out from the ground beneath the storm. Only there was no ground there, Rilke realised, just a void. It had simply been erased. The man watched her brother the way a lizard tracks a bug, its black eyes full of greed, full of hunger. But there was a spark of recognition there. It understood who Schiller was. It knows you, she told her brother, looking up to where he blazed against the unnatural light, a star that had been knocked loose from the firmament. Her heart seemed to lift alongside him, the knowledge that she had been right, that they were here to serve the man in the storm. She grinned, the euphoria a flood of sunlight inside her arteries, making her feel like she was already nothing but heat and light. It didn't last. The man in the storm twitched its fingers and turned the world inside out. The ground crumbled away beneath her, the air suddenly full of rock and stone and houses. She opened her mouth to scream, but it never came as she tumbled into darkness, as though she was falling into a bottomless grave. Schiller still burned high above her, and she reached out for him, knowing that if she didn't, then she would fall forever. Her brother's eyes raged, a flicker of emotion deep inside the fire, and she felt his arms wrap around her, not his flesh, but something else. He wrenched her from the pit, pulling her up to his side along with Marcus and the other boy, holding her to him with a thought while the city crumbled around them. There was no ground between her and the storm any more, just the void, an ocean of emptiness. The man gestured with his hands again, pulling up the earth as though he was lifting a blanket. On either side of him, 1 billion tons of matter rose into the air, hurled towards them. The air roared, Rilke's ears popping as a concussive wave of pressure reached them first. She lifted her hands to her face, knowing that they would offer her no protection, that she would be crushed into dust. But even though the world shook and shook and shook, there was no impact, no pain. She peeked between her fingers, seeing a bubble of flickering firelight around them. House-sized pieces of concrete smashed against the shield like waves against the rocks. Cars and trucks and trees and people too, bursting into liquid as they struck. The tide was endless, flooding into the darkness beneath them, pressing against them, gushing overhead, making her feel as though she was inside a cave, her brother burning like a campfire. There was nothing written on his face, no sign of Schiller's human weakness, everything blazing at full strength as he fought to keep them alive. The torrent stopped, the sky opening up once again, still full of smoke, a waterfall of matter dropping into the darkness. Ahead of them, the man hung in his storm, and there was something else in those eyes now, not so much in them, she understood, as being channeled through them. It was hate, pure and simple. It wanted to kill them. "What have I done?" she asked, panicking, seeing the gulf beneath her feet, an open mouth just waiting for her to fall. Schiller's power was the only thing keeping them up, and how much longer would it last? She grabbed her brother, the flames cold against her skin, tickling her. He beat his wings, the bubble of fire around them guttering out, spirals of dust dancing off in all directions. Marcus hung beside her, held by invisible fingers. The new kid too, the four of them locked in the fury of the man's eyes. "Oh, what have I done, Schiller? I was wrong. I was so wrong." The howl of the man's endless breath increased, black streaks slicing through the air as if life was a canvas being torn. The storm once again began to funnel into his gaping maw, debris pulled from the air, sucked inside. Rilke too, her stomach doing loop-the-loops as she hurtled towards him. She held on to her brother with everything she had, even though she knew she didn't need to, feeling him being pulled through the air like a boat into a whirlpool. "Fight it!" she yelled into his ear, barely able to hear herself. His answer fluttered into her thoughts. I can't, Rilke, he's so strong." The current was too powerful, dragging them towards the churning blades of his mouth. They were speeding up, the man looming before them, so big, a colossus. His eyes burned. He was going to eat them. And then what? Then nothing. You will never have been, and will never be again. "Schiller!" she pleaded. Her brother spoke, the word like a missile detonating in the middle of the storm. The man didn't even seem to feel it, reeling them in faster, until there was only his mouth, only that boundless, lightless throat. Schiller spoke again, but his voice was human, a kitten's mewl. His coat of flames vanished, and he flailed in mid-air, caught in the flow. It was done. It was over. It was lost. Rilke closed her eyes, took a deep breath that stank of flesh and smoke, and screamed, "Daisy!" Oh, my phone has gone crazy. Hang on. It's skipping through the pages like it's alive. I need a new phone, I think. Hang on. It's gone like... Right, there we go. Daisy. East Walsham. 12:24 p.m. Daisy! Daisy looked up at the sound of her name. The ice cubes had grown agitated. They were all retreating, all except for one, his one, where the man in the storm still hung. She didn't want to look, but how could she stop herself? The view it contained was different now. The city rubbed away beneath him, the way she would just rub away a piece of a drawing that she didn't like. Everything around him was still being vacuumed into his mouth. Daisy! Her name again, and this time she recognised the voice. It was Rilke's. And sure enough, wasn't that her and her brother and Marcus and Howie right there, like insects drowning in dust as they were funnelled into the storm? Oh, Rilke, you went to him, just like you said, she thought, the sadness like a pressure in her chest. And now the girl was going to die. Why hadn't Rilke listened to her? Why hadn't she believed her? She was so stupid. That pressure shifted, growing, and Daisy's heart gave a painful thump. It wasn't sadness. It was something else. She put her hand, the one she didn't really have in this place, against her chest, feeling the coldness there. And when she looked down, tongues of flame licked between her fingers. Oh no, she said. It is happening. Her angel was hatching. Daisy? Another voice this time, from somewhere close by. She peered between the huge, grinding ice cubes to see the new boy there, Howie. Not his physical body, that was with Rilke in the storm. This was just the other part of him. His soul, she guessed. He was the same age as her, maybe a little older. A pocket of fire sat in his chest too, spreading up towards his shoulders and down to his tummy like he was made of straw. He looked terrified, his eyes wide and white, staring at himself like a boy who had seen spiders burst from his skin. It's okay, she said to him, trying to hide her own fear. She held out her hands, and in an instant he was next to her, hugging her, his not-real head buried in her not-real shoulder. She stroked his hair, whispering to him, "Don't worry, they won't hurt you. They're here to keep us safe. They're good, they're friendly. Don't be scared." It didn't hurt. It was more like when you go swimming and you first get into the water, so cold to start with, but soon you didn't even notice it. Already the icy touch of the flames had reached her neck, now her chin. She held Howie and he held her, both of them going up in flames together. Something was chiming inside her head, a tune almost like the one her little music box had played when she was a kid. There were no words there, and yet she knew that this was a voice, that this was its voice. "Can you hear that?" she asked, feeling Howie nod against her. "It's not scary, is it?" She looked down to see that the fire was everywhere now, all over her, inside her too. She felt as weightless as air, as though she was a beam of light. Motes of dust bobbed around her, drawn to her, and the ice was melting despite the chill, rivulets of crystal-clear water forming a pool beneath her feet. The tune in her head grew louder as her angel found its voice, and even though she could not understand it, she still knew what it was showing her. The 1,000,000,000 years of its life laid out in a single second. There was no time to process it before she felt herself pulled up, the same way she sometimes rose from dreams, like a diver being winched from the ocean on a rope. She screwed her eyes shut against the sudden rush of vertigo. "It will be okay," she said as Howie vanished, heading back to his body in the real world. He would be an angel now too, she knew. Trust me." She breached the surface of the dream ocean, the real world knitting itself around her, a church, stained glass windows, wooden pews, but nothing looking like it had before. She felt as though she could peer into the very heart of things, see the building blocks there, the little atoms in their orbits. If she wanted, she could pull them apart with just a thought. Her fire was the brightest thing here, blazing forth from her, kicking out a bass hum that seemed to make everything tremble. It wasn't so bad, was it? It was... And then it hit her. a sudden panic, the awful knowledge of what she was. She looked at herself, at the inferno of her skin, the way her hands seemed translucent, tiny blots of energy surging up and down her fingers. Something was pushing at her back too, as if her ribs were trying to claw their way free. Not pain, just a maddening itch. And when she realised what it was, "Oh, my wings, oh God," she shrieked. That noise, the noise that of a monstrous baby bird pushing from its shell. She turned, trying to see them, but the motion carried too much force, launching her across the room. She flew into a wall, her wings twitching, out of her control, sending her spinning back across the church. Somewhere in the wheeling chaos, she saw Brick and Cal and little Adam, all of them diving for cover. There was another man too, a vicar by the look of things, screaming at her, lost to the fury. She held out her hands to the man, trying to tell him not to be scared, but to her horror, he detonated into a cloud of ash, hanging ghost-like in the air until he remembered to drift apart. Oh, God. Daisy screamed, the noise like when the jet engines power up in a plane. Her wings twitched once more, hurling her up into the rafters. "Stop it, please, stop it! Oh, God, I just want to go back to being me, please, please, please!" But the angel would not hear her, making her thrash against the ceiling, her huge beating wings loosing an avalanche of ancient wood and stone. She pushed herself away, dropping back to the floor, but not hitting it, just hovering above it, as though there was an invisible cushion there. "Daisy!" Her name again, but this time it was Cal. She saw him run down the aisle towards her, stumbling on the wreckage of a pew. She held out her hands to him, but the movement sent her tumbling back, cartwheeling down the church. She shrieked again, the sound exploding a stained glass window, flooding darkness with sunlight. Stay still, she ordered her body. She froze, listening to the dizzying thrum of the angel. That's what its heart sounds like, hearing the patter of footsteps. Cal skidded down beside her, squinting against her brightness. It looked just like him, but when she focused hard enough, she could see the bits and pieces he was made of, the slick butcher shop organs, the pores in his skin, and deeper than that, the cells that swam in his blood and the fireworks show of sparks inside his brain. She didn't like it. She didn't like seeing that people were just engines of flesh. But she didn't turn away in case she hurt him. "Daisy, can you hear me?" he asked. He lifted a hand, a constellation of atoms, as if to place it on her, then seemed to change his mind. "Are you okay?" She didn't dare reply. Her voice was something else now, a weapon. It reminded her of what she'd just seen before she'd hatched. Rilke and the others being sucked into the mouth of the storm. That's why her angel had hatched now, because they needed her to save them. But how? They were all the way over in the city. Even as she asked the question, the thing inside her gave an answer, not with its voice, just with an image. Her in a field with Adam, trapped in a car, holding hands and somehow moving themselves. Of course. It made sense, didn't it? Time and space, they weren't real anymore. Not to her. "Is she okay?" It was Brick this time, standing at the back of the church with his hands in his copper hair. His face was a mask of concern, and she did her best to smile. It didn't do much to calm him, which wasn't really a surprise. If she looked anything like Schiller had, then her eyes were made of molten steel. "I think so," said Cal. "Daisy, can you hear me?" "Yes," she said, speaking to them inside her head, somehow beaming the words out. This voice couldn't hurt them. "I'm here, Cal. Don't be frightened." Cal grinned, looking over his shoulder. "You hear her?" he asked, and Brick nodded. Cal turned back. "How are you doing that?" Daisy didn't answer because she didn't know. Brick took a few steps down the aisle, and Daisy noticed that he was holding Adam's hand. She called out to him with her mind, getting used to the sound of the words inside her head. "Hello, Adam. It's only me, Daisy. I know I look different, but I'm still your friend, okay?" The boy nodded, a shiver of a smile darting over his lips. Daisy took a deep breath, though she didn't think she even needed air the way she was right now, and pushed herself off the ground. Slow, considered movements. That was the trick. Nothing too dramatic. She rose to her knees, then gave her wings an experimental flex. It was weird, like having an extra pair of arms. She felt them cut through the real world like a hot knife through butter, lifting her up until she was hovering over the floor. It felt so strange being up here, taller even than Brick now. She felt like an adult, which was kind of exciting and kind of sad too. She didn't want to be grown up just yet. "What was it like?" asked Cal, his eyes looking as if they were about to pop right out of his head. "It doesn't hurt," she answered. It's I can't really explain it. It's like wearing a superhero costume or driving a car. Yeah, it's a bit like that, a car, because if you do the wrong thing, you can hurt someone. She remembered the vicar clamping a hand to her mouth as she turned to the far side of the church. All that remained of the man was a little puddle of burning ash. A halo of glowing embers floated in a circle around it, as if they didn't want to stop living yet, as if they could keep death away with a dance. "Oh no. What did I do?" she said. I killed him." Yet the stew of emotion she was expecting, that unbearable flood of sadness, didn't come. Once, when she was about 8, she'd found a beetle in the back garden, a tiny one about the size of her thumbnail. She'd wanted to bring it into the house to be friends with it and keep it in a matchbox, and she'd tried to get it to climb onto a stick, but it kept scuttling off and running away. And in her frustration, she'd accidentally jabbed it too hard and killed it dead. She'd cried and cried and cried. That poor beetle had died because of her. She thought that she would never, ever forgive herself. Now, though, her sadness was a forgotten thing inside her tummy, there, but hidden. The angel is protecting me from it, she realised, like a shield. And with that knowledge came the understanding that it could not last forever, that as soon as she went back to being normal, that awful sadness would suddenly be there again. "You didn't mean to, Days," Cal said, using a pew to pull himself to his feet. "It wasn't your fault." "I know," she replied. She would mourn him later, but now there was something else she needed to do. "Cal, we have to save them. Rilke and Schiller, they need us." She saw the image in her head, the man in the storm sucking them into his churning mouth, and she knew that Cal and Brick and Adam saw it too. "They're going to die." At the back of the church, Brick spat out a laugh. "They can go screw themselves," he said. "Why should we help her? She's done this to herself." "Kind of got a point there," said Cal, shrugging. "She did ask for it." "It's not about her," said Daisy. "We need her. We need all of them if we're going to fight it. I don't think we can do it by ourselves." They didn't have any time. It might already be too late. "Please, Cal, we have to go." The thought of it, of cutting a hole in space and climbing through, finding herself in the shadow of the man in the storm, should have been terrifying. But this too was numbed by the angel. It felt more like an echo of fear, something she couldn't quite remember. "It's keeping me strong," she thought to herself. "It's keeping me brave." "Please, Cal," she said again, and she held out her hand to him. Plant-like tendrils of light rose up from the stone beneath her, made of nothing but light, each one fading. After a moment, Cal studied them, then looked up at her. "Do we have a choice?" he asked. "Of course," she said. "You all have a choice, but you have to choose the right one." Cal looked back at Brick, the two boys sharing a thought that Daisy couldn't quite read. Then Cal turned to her and nodded his head. His fear pumped out of him in big, black waves, but his expression was firm. He swallowed noisily, then took her hand. She seemed to see his whole life play out in a heartbeat, his home and his mum and a pretty girl called Georgia, and her heart grew heavy as if she'd lived that life alongside him. She held him gently, careful not to hurt him. Adam pulled himself free from Brick and raced down the aisle, hugging her around the waist. "Brick?" she asked. The older boy stood there, shuffling his feet, chewing his lip. She saw the lightning show inside his skull, saw the thoughts there racing back and forth, fighting with each other, and the moment where his decision was made. She didn't even wait for him to nod. She just used her mind to open up a hole in the air, reality burning away around her, as though the skin of the world had caught fire. Behind it was the city and the storm, and with a beat of her wings, she pulled them all towards it. Brick, London, 12:32 p.m. Daisy didn't even give him a chance to reply. One second he was standing in the church wondering how the hell he was going to get out of this one. The next he felt like a spinning top set in motion. He somersaulted upwards, everything a blur, his stomach scrunching to the size of an acorn. Then his senses snapped back on and he was somewhere else, lying on his back. He opened his mouth to cry out, but all that emerged was a jet of white sick. The air was full of embers, landing on his tongue and leaving their bitter taste. He spat them out, wiping puke from his lips, then struggled into a sitting position. Daisy was a few metres in front of him. Only it wasn't Daisy, not anymore. The creature she was now, the one that had stolen her body, hovered above the ground, still engulfed in flame. Her wings were like the sails of a burning ship, twice as tall as she was, and the noise she was pumping out was an electric charge, pulsing through the air, through the ground, making his fingers tingle and his hair stand on end. It made no sense that the little girl he'd been carrying just a few hours ago, that bundle of stick-like bones, could now be this. He had to look away. But what he saw there was infinitely worse. The sky above the horizon was like an upturned ocean, a roiling sea of darkness whose waves carried the city. Is this London? It can't be, there's nothing left. Carried the city into their depths. And in the middle of the ocean was a shape, illuminated by bolts of black lightning that lashed through the chaos. He hung there like a leviathan, a vast, bloated sea beast churning up the water. The sight was so awful that a groan rose up from Brick's stomach, feeble and wretched, spilling from his mouth. And before he could stop himself, he was sobbing, scrabbling back, screaming, "Why did you bring me here? Why?" "Brick, get a hold of yours." It was Cal yelling from where he stood a few metres away, his words snatched away by the howling wind. He was hunkered down, his hair whipping around his face. Adam, the little boy, was still hugging Daisy, his face buried so deep in her stomach that Brick wondered how his skin hadn't been burned away by the flames. "Get over here!" He shook his head, still crawling backwards. He bumped into something, yelping, turning to see a car. It was so covered in orange dust that it looked as though it had been sitting there for 100 years. He used it to pull himself up, stepped back, his foot plunging into something soft. It was a body, he realised as he looked down. A ringing itch formed in Brick's mind, something not quite working the way it should up there. He stepped out of the corpse, shaking his encrusted trainer, seeing the other bodies lying like spilled dominoes. Dozens of them. Oh no, oh no, oh no, no, no. Why hadn't they left him in the church? It had been safe there, especially with the vicar dead. He could have stayed there for days. He could have stayed there forever. "Because we need you, Brick." Daisy's voice was so loud in his head, so clear that she could have been standing there in the flesh of his brain. He even thumped a hand to his temple, as if to shake her out. But no, she still hovered there above the pavement, framed by the rubble of a dozen houses, her eyes boiling, spitting flecks of fire, her mouth hanging open to reveal a throat of pure white light, as if she'd swallowed the sun. "I need you, Brick. I can't do this by myself." "But what the hell can I do?" he cried back. Beneath the storm, the ground had been erased, a pit that must have been 10 miles wide. How could he stand up to a creature that could do that? It would turn him inside out, with just a look. "Believe in me," Daisy said. "That's all I need." He shook his head again, hard as if he was trying to detach a blue bottle from his thoughts. "Please, Brick." A deafening clap of thunder blasted from the centre of the storm, and Brick looked to see lightning there, not dark this time, but bright. A shockwave of scalding air blasted across the city, almost hard enough to knock him backwards, and in the heart of the tornado he thought he saw a huge, gaping maw. There was a burning shape right next to it, so small that it could have been a plankton about to be devoured by a whale. He knew who it was, and he spoke the boy's name aloud. "Schiller." "I have to go to him," Daisy said inside his head, her voice half hers and half her angel's. "They'll die if I don't." She cast the furnace of her eyes to the sky, at the distant battle that raged there. It was insane. Angel or not, that thing, the man in the storm, it would crush her. She was just a little girl. Cal yelled something that Brick couldn't make out. "But I have to," she replied. "I do, it's just like the play." Oh, the play, Romeo and Juliet, feels like a million years ago, doesn't it? Brick had no idea what she meant by that, even though her words carried images into his head. A stage, kids dressed up in old-fashioned clothes, and a worm of discomfort burrowed into his stomach. "It's scary," she said. "Really scary, but you know you have to do it." She looked at Cal, then at Brick. "Be strong. Look after Adam." "Daisy, wait," Cal said, but it was too late. She flexed her wings, their tips seeming to set fire to the air as if it was paper. There was a flash of light, a gaping hole in the sky. Then she was gone. Reality flooded back into the space like water, a pistol crack echoing around the ruined street as the vacuum was filled. Adam staggered forwards, almost falling before Brick caught him, both of them standing there in a snowstorm of ash. Another crack, and Brick looked into the storm to see a flash of light there, right in the heart of its darkness. Daisy, burning bright. "She's just a little girl," he thought, suddenly furious. He smashed himself on the chest with his fist, calling to the creature that slept there. "Are you happy now? She's just a little girl and you've killed her." He took a step towards the storm, then stopped. He needed to help her, but what could he do? Never in his life had he felt so small, so pathetic. He caught Cal's eye, saw the frustration there, the powerlessness mirroring his own. "We have to do something," Brick said. "She'll die." Cal cocked his head to the side. "What?" asked Brick. "Don't you hear that?" It was a few more seconds until he did. A soft whine rising up over the ceaseless thunder of the storm. An engine coming this way. "Oh, Daisy can handle herself," said Cal, pointing as a motorbike skidded around a pile of debris at the end of the demolished street, accelerating their way. "We've got bigger problems." Daisy. What are we doing for time? Yeah, maybe a couple more. Daisy, London, 12:38 p.m. It was like throwing herself into a fast-flowing river, the current sweeping her up, pulling her along against her will, so fast and so strong that she didn't even know which way was up. She spun in mid-air, seeing storm and sky, then him, his mouth so big it could have been a volcano, that she was hurtling towards. She could see his eyes too, like two inverse suns in the sky, radiating darkness, huge, and staring right at her. She snapped out her limbs, all 6 of them, arms, legs and wings. It was like opening a parachute, slowing her sideways fall. The wind was a living thing that buffeted her, huge chunks of stuff flying past, sucked into the vortex. She felt like Dorothy in the tornado, seeing whole houses there and people too, everything being devoured. A flash of light up ahead in the middle of the man's mouth. "Schiller!" she called. "I'm coming!" "Daisy!" The voice was his, broadcast right into her head. "Help us!" The storm man's mouth ground relentlessly, but Daisy's fear was still a tiny thing in her tummy, as if the angel was holding it for her, looking after it. She willed herself to move, and her body obeyed, her beating wings propelling her forwards. It was like riding a bike, she thought. You think it's impossible to start with. You think you'll never, ever be able to find your balance. And then suddenly there you are, racing down the path, and you can't even remember what it was like to not be able to ride. It felt as if she'd had this body forever, as if she'd been born with it. She twisted to one side to avoid a slab of spinning concrete, screaming as she smashed through the sidewall of a floating house. It came apart around her, blasted into brick dust. Ahead she could make out not one angel but 2. Howie, of course. He's hatched too. He and Schiller were hovering inside a bubble of orange fire, the pair of them so bright that at first Daisy didn't even notice Rilke and Marcus beside them, held up by invisible string. There was no sign of Jade. "Hang on," she thought to them. In an instant she was there, right on the edge of the vortex. The current was unbelievably strong, the man doing everything he could to pull her into his gullet. Beyond was nothing, not darkness, not light, just an infinite, gaping absence that made Daisy's head hurt to look at. The worst thing, though, was that even though the storm still raged, all that emanated from his mouth was a creeping, deafening silence. It was like she'd gone deaf in one ear. She snapped out her wings again, locking herself in place. Schiller and Howie were doing the same. It was taking everything they had to stop themselves disappearing down the drain of his mouth. What was she supposed to do? Talk to him, she told herself, like you said you were going to. Tell him to leave you alone. Daisy cracked her wings, lifting herself up to where the man's eyes blazed. She wasn't even sure if they were eyes, because other than them and his mouth, the man didn't really have a face, just a whirling gyre of smoke and storm. And yet they seemed to study her, his hate like a living thing that thrashed and writhed there. She opened her mouth, felt fire burning up from her stomach, scorching her throat, blasting from her mouth. What she'd wanted to say was leave us alone, but what came out was a word that she didn't know, a word that wasn't human. It was as though she'd spat out a rocket, a pulse of energy escaping her lips with such force that it flipped her backwards. She righted herself in time to see the shockwave strike the man in his left eye, a wave of fire that ate into the rippling black flesh like water through snow. "I'm sorry!" Daisy shouted. She hadn't wanted to hurt him, she just wanted him to go away. She opened her mouth to tell him that, but another word cannoned out, this one carving its way into his other eye, ripping loose chunks of flickering dark matter that swept down towards his mouth. The monster's head rocked backwards, and that gaping inward breath guttered out. It was as if gravity had suddenly been switched on again, everything falling towards the void below. Daisy punched out her wings, seeing Schiller and Howie do the same. She flew to them through a monsoon of dust and debris. "Schiller!" she yelled. The two angels were so alike that she almost couldn't tell them apart, but somehow she still knew which one he was. He looked at her with twin suns of his eyes, and even through the fire she could see that he was injured. Rilke clung onto him like a baby monkey. Marcus hung beside them, buoyed up by some invisible force. They both looked so weak, so vulnerable. "Go! Get them out of here!" she said. "I don't want to leave you," Schiller replied in her head. Daisy reached out to him, her hand made of fire, looking see-through, a ghost's hand. She brushed it over his ghost face, their flames overlapping, joining. When she pulled away, she drew dewdrops of golden light from his skin. "Go, I'll be okay." He nodded, closed his eyes and burned himself and the others out of existence. Air rushed in to fill the space they'd just occupied, making the glowing embers bob and play. Daisy looked through them to see Howie there, his face, both a boy's and an angel's all in one. She felt like she had known him for so long that it was hard to believe this was the first time they'd actually met. "Are you okay?" He didn't get a chance to reply. The man in the storm was recovering, the engine of his mouth starting up again, sucking Daisy in. The noise was so loud that it felt like a fist pummeling her brain, a million-strong orchestra of steel drums playing out of sync. She screamed, her voice almost as loud, a physical thing that cut upwards into the churning sky, blasting away clouds so that, just for a second, the sun shone through. She flapped her wings, imagining she was a bird darting away. Another huge piece of building spun towards her, but she passed right through it, ripping it to pieces. Howie was beside her, his wings pumping. "We have to fight it," Daisy said. "Just speak. The angels know what to do." They turned together, facing the man. Daisy opened her mouth, the word halfway up her throat, before a bolt of black lightning snapped out from the storm and lashed across her chest. She felt as if everything inside her had been pulled loose, the blow sending her hurtling through the air. She extended her wings, but it only seemed to make her spin faster. Another whip crack, then a shout that could only have been Howie fighting back. "Come on!" she yelled at herself, pushing her wings out with every ounce of strength she had, controlling her fall. She looked back at the storm. It seemed miles away now, patting the flames of her body to make sure everything was okay. Her human heart thumped. Her angel heart thrummed, but that awful feeling sat in her tummy. It was the same feeling she'd had when she'd found her mum and dad dead in the bed. Only so much worse. It was the storm. That's how it wanted the whole world to feel. The thought made her furious, dwarfing the tickle of fear. She flicked her wings, propelling herself into the heaving mass of the tornado. Howie was there, a blur of fire against the darkness, his shouts crashing against the skin of the beast. More jagged thorns of black lightning tore up towards him, unleashing a fountain of sparks when they snapped against his burning armour. Daisy opened her mouth and let the angel speak, the word boiling through the air, smashing into the beast. It fired another shard of broken black light her way, and she dodged it with a twist of her wing, speaking again, then again, Howie joining her, forcing the storm back. Its sucking breath snapped off again, the turbine of its gullet stalling. She didn't let up, screaming another word out, seeing it eat into the skin of his face. It's working, keep going," she said to Howie, the words in her head joined by another from her mouth, something ancient and alien that split the air in two as it roared towards the storm. "Keep going, Howie, we're going to beat him." The man's mouth opened even wider, seeming to take up the whole sky. This time he didn't breathe in, but out, a monstrous foghorn that punched her backwards. She blacked out for a moment, as though her brain was a computer restarting, and when she came to, she realised she was falling. She screamed, and the voice was hers. When she tried to move her wings, they did not obey. She looked down at herself, the flames gone, just her own body there, her school uniform, one shoe missing. She tumbled towards the abyss below, calling out to her angel. "Where are you? Come back!" The beast was still pumping out its call, a word that seemed endless. The air was full of movement, a million pieces of debris churning towards her in a tidal wave. Something struck her, the pain unbelievable, filling her whole body as the pit rose up to greet her. "Oh no, Daisy!" I'll do one more. Cal, London, 12:42 p.m. Cal watched the motorbike glide to a stop in the middle of the street beside the ruin of a house. There were 2 people on it, a man and a woman, neither of them wearing helmets. "We should go," said Brick. He'd let go of Adam and was stumbling over a mound of broken stone. The little kid didn't even seem to notice, wide-eyed as he watched the skies. Above them the storm still raged, and Cal could see where Daisy hung, a burning moon orbiting a core of darkness. "Be safe," he told her, turning back. The man clambered off the bike and held up his hands as if to show that he wasn't armed. The woman followed, taking a couple of steps towards them. They turned and spoke to each other, the man shrugging. "Who the hell are these guys?" Cal asked. Brick didn't answer, still retreating, leaving Adam in between him and the newcomers. Unbelievable, Cal thought, stretching out his hand to the boy. "Adam, mate, come here." The man shouted something, but the roar of the storm was just too loud. "Don't want to hurt you. Just ask some questions." The man tried again, his shout reduced to a whisper. "What?" Cal called back. Something detonated inside the storm, a pop of thunder. The woman moved forward and Cal waved her back. "No, stay there. Don't come any closer." She couldn't hear him, taking another step their way. Brick was half running, half tripping over the cracked tarmac. Cal moved towards Adam, ready to pick him up and carry him away. "Wait!" the bike man was yelling. "Just come back!" The woman took another step, and just like that she turned, charging forwards. Oh, Cal swore, breaking into a sprint. The woman lunged at Adam, her lips pulled back over her teeth. She was fast, half pouncing, half falling on the boy, grabbing fistfuls of his hair. "Get off him!" Cal slammed into her, as if he was playing rugby, the impact sending them both sprawling across the ground. They rolled, her mouth a cobra's, snapping at his arms, his throat, her teeth clacking. He managed to pin her down, aimed a punch only to be bucked off by her writhing body. He grabbed flesh, locking himself in place, trying again. His fist connected with her nose in an eruption of blood, but she didn't even seem to feel it, scraping at him with broken fingernails. "Brick!" Cal tried to shout, but there wasn't enough air in his lungs. He glanced over to see the bigger boy hanging back behind a car, just watching. "You selfish bastard," he thought. A look in the other direction told him that at least the man wasn't moving any closer. The woman, the thing beneath him, grabbed his face in an iron fist, her thumb in his eye socket. Cal let out a guttural cry, batting her away, lashing out again, hearing something crack beneath his fist. He wedged his elbow into her throat, putting all his weight on it, trying to deflect her flailing arms with his free hand. She groaned, choking, the most horrific sound Cal had heard in his life. But the murder never left her bulging eyes. "I'm sorry," he screamed. "I'm sorry." A gunshot ripped across the street. Cal looked back, blinded by fire, realising that it hadn't been a gunshot at all. Schiller stood there, a statue of flame, his wings the tallest thing in the demolished street. Rilke and Marcus were on their knees beside him. Schiller looked over with his molten eyes, and the woman beneath Cal popped. He fell into the mess of her, suddenly drowning inside a cloud of ash. He coughed, rolling away, lying on his back for as long as it took him to remember the man. When he glanced over again, though, he saw that the man had fallen onto his backside, his mouth hanging open. "Wait!" he shouted. "I don't want to hurt you." Rilke pointed to him. "Kill him too," she said, her voice perfectly clear. The storm had grown quiet. Cal looked up to see that it was no longer sucking in air. The twin flames of Daisy and the other boy hung beside its mouth, emitting barking shouts that seemed to explode against the darkness like anti-aircraft fire. "They're winning," he thought, the relief like sunlight inside him. Then the beast opened his jaws, and a fist of noise erupted from his mouth. He vomited a cloud of dust, a whole city reduced to rubble and blasted outwards, engulfing the light, making the day grow even darker. Schiller spread his wings, took a deep breath, then vanished with such speed that his sister fell through him. She scuttled on her hands and knees like a crab until she found her balance. "Schiller, no!" she screamed at the storm, holding her hands out to it. "No! She doesn't need you! I need you!" The man in the storm breathed out his cloud of poison, the ground shaking so much that Cal had to crouch down to stop from falling. A spark ignited in the maelstrom, Schiller fighting against the tide. "Schiller!" Rilke called again. But it was too late. He was gone. Cal scrambled up, running across the street, stopping 25-30 metres away from the motorbike man. "Who are you?" he yelled. He had to repeat himself twice before the man could hear him over the sound of the storm. He stepped forwards, but Cal held up his hand. "Come any closer and you'll die," he said. "Just tell me what you want." "My name's Graham Haling," he yelled back, "and I want to help." Should we leave it there? That was a short chapter. Yeah, we'll leave it there because that's... Actually, the next one's quite short. Should we do one more? Let's do one more. Let's find out what happens to Daisy. We can't leave her falling into the void. Daisy, London, 12:46 p.m. She felt like a stone thrown into the ocean, plummeting into the cold, lightless depths. On either side of her, she could see distant walls of sheer rock where the city had been torn in half, waterfalls of debris falling from the top of them. Beneath her was nothing but the pit. "Please," she called out to her angel, but it didn't answer. Something bad had happened to it. "Help me." She fell, tumbling head over feet, the world above growing darker and quieter with every thrashing beat of her pulse. Any second now she'd hit the bottom, and that would be it. She'd be buried here forever, in this hole, miles away from everyone and everything. It was the worst thought in the world until another one occurred to her, that the pit might simply go on forever, that she might never stop falling. She screamed for help again, her wretched cry lost in the roar of wind in her ears. Fire erupting, and for a second she thought her angel had returned. Then she felt arms around her and turned to see Schiller there, falling alongside her. He extended his wings, the flames impossibly bright against the shadows. Then came the familiar stomach-churning rush as he carried them out of the pit. They reappeared in the middle of the storm, in the centre of the beast's raging howl, and Daisy had flexed her wings before she realised her angel was back. "Oh, thank you," she said to them both, breaking free of Schiller in order to avoid a hail of concrete and metal that ripped past. Something else was hurtling towards her, a tower block still intact. She opened her mouth and let her angel speak, the word hitting the building like a missile, demolishing it in mid-air. She soared through the dust, through the million pieces of rock that still streamed from the beast's mouth, heading for a distant flame that had to be Howie. He was still shouting, still fighting. "Come on," she called to Schiller. He appeared next to her, weaving in and out of the storm, his eyes like lighthouse beams searing into the gloom. The beast was up ahead, his mouth the biggest thing Daisy had ever seen, a mountain-sized hole in the sky. She screamed at him, a shockwave of sound that vaporised a path through the chaos, striking him between the eyes. Beside her, Schiller called out, his voice a cannon shot. Daisy ducked and weaved until she hung beside Howie, the three of them punching out word after word until the man's face was a nest of burning black worms. "Is it working?" Schiller asked. The thunder of the storm was so loud that Daisy had trouble hearing his words even though they were inside her head. "Is he dying?" "I think so," she replied, firing another word, pulling apart even more of the storm. She felt like a summer wind, clearing the clouds from the sky with her breath. "Just keep going." The beast shook its giant head, so big that it looked as though it was moving in slow motion. A noise like machine gun fire rose up from inside him, followed by a bolt of black lightning, so dark that it burned its shape into Daisy's eyes. It grazed her, knocking her back, but it was Schiller who took the brunt of it. The light hit his face with a whip crack, another one snaking up and punching through his torso like a harpoon, gone as quickly as it appeared. The boy's fire flickered off and he began to fall. "No!" Daisy cried, the word twinned with one of the angels, burning from her lips, hitting the beast like a huge invisible hammer. Howie screamed as well, his cry detonating in the middle of the storm. Daisy tucked in her wings, diving after Schiller, seeing him slam into a chunk of something big, his body spinning like a ragdoll. She reached out to him with her mind, wrapping phantom hands around him, using the same thought to shield him from the flying rubble. She reeled him in, holding him next to her as another fork of lightless lightning lashed across the sky, close enough that she could feel its icy touch on her skin. Schiller wasn't moving. She couldn't even be sure he was breathing, and when she peered into his skull she could see none of the little flickering thoughts there. Her anger was like an engine powering up inside her, accelerating up her throat and exploding as another shout. The noise it made as it left her lips was like a crack of thunder, and when it struck the man it stripped the storm away to reveal the pasty white skin of his bloated face. The flesh seemed to melt, dripping down into his eyes like candle wax. She didn't hesitate, screaming again and again and again, her words and the angels combined. Die! 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 It uttered a deafening groan, the sound of a huge ship sinking. The storm from its mouth had all but stopped, and the rage in its eyes had been replaced with something else, something that might have been fear. It looked at her, at Schiller, at Howie, as though it was studying them, remembering their faces. Then the sky went black, as if it had pulled night over itself. Daisy couldn't quite work out what had happened until she looked up and saw them. Wings. 2 of them, crafted from flame so dark that it looked as if somebody had cut their shape out of the world with a giant pair of scissors. They radiated their black light across what remained of the city, and she thought that if fire could rot, then this is what it would look like. It was horrible, and yet hanging there before it, her own wings spread, and her own eyes blazing, there was no way to ignore it. She could have been looking into a mirror. A carnival one, yes, that distorted your reflection, but a mirror nonetheless. The beast swept its vast wings down. The storm ripped outwards, the creature's fire spreading, burning up its body and over its face. Daisy realised what it was doing and shouted out another word, but it was too late. With a thunderous crack and another flash of blinding darkness, the beast vanished. Air rushed into the space it had occupied, buffeting her, everything that had been held up by the storm now dropping into the pit. Something huge missed her by millimetres, and she grabbed Schiller, pulling him close. "Let's go," she said to Howie. He nodded at her, his eyes burning, and together they blinked out of existence. Whew. This is, I think it was safe to say that the battle has begun. I'll leave it there for today. We are past the halfway point now, and I've got the feeling it's about to heat up quite significantly as they battle each other for the survival of the planet and the human race. I hope you enjoyed that. Pretty gory. I'd forgotten that Daisy just the priest, the vicar, who's just kind of survived this whole thing, and then Daisy just pops back and he's like into dust. Yeah, sorry about that, vicar. I hope you have a lovely day, whatever you're doing. I'll be back very soon. Hopefully very soon. Like I say, life keeps getting in the way, but hopefully very soon. As we slide towards the end of this book. Take care of yourselves. Thank you for joining me. Your company is always very much appreciated. And yeah, I will see you very soon. Take care. Cheerio.